Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We would look in today's presentation into targeted sanctions which are relevant for dealing with Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic. And we group together these three countries, which, for example, have very different historical background for the reasons that all of them were affected by the same recent events, namely the fall of Qaddafi regime in Libya, which substantially contributed to vulnerabilities of those regimes which were governing in all of these three countries. And as a result of that, descended into a civil conflict, like in case of the Central African Republic of Mali, or overthrow of the civil government and increased presence of various jihadist groups, like in case of Niger. And these similarities in terms of the triggers for the recent political events in those three countries resulted in the imposition of the targeted sanctions by the United Nations or UN member states or regional organizations like ECOWAS in case of Niger. And this permits us to discuss them in common. And we will do so by doing what we typically do in the geographical series of our series Sanctions 360. We would look into the geopolitical background from the perspective of setting the stage for the current sanctions programs, trying to explain those purposes which those programs try to achieve. We would discuss key political and military players in each of those countries to explain the reasons of the selection of the targets. And then we would go through the current sanctions regime which are in place with respect to each of those three jurisdictions. There are the causes for the current situations in Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic, and there are the triggers. The causes can be summarized as the highly vulnerable political institutions, which in part is the result of these countries being among the poorest countries in the world, highly dependent on the economic aid and development aid provided for the support of those military institutions, and located in the areas of extreme geographic conditions, like, for example, Niger. These general issues have been exacerbated recently by the climate change, which caused the expansion of Sahara, particularly relevant for Mali and Niger, where the majority of territory is allocated in Saharan, sub-Saharan region. So the expansion of Sahara has gradually decreased the amount of arable land available for various ethnic groups, and as a result of that, increase the competition between those groups. Together with the countries being rich in natural resources, for example, Mali has particularly substantial deposits of gold, Niger of uranium, being top 10 exporter of uranium, as well as the Central African Republic having substantial reserves in diamonds and gold, as well as oil being present in all of those three countries. So the presence of those natural resources obviously creates a incentive, perverse incentive for military groups to get control over the relevant areas and to start using those for the advantage of them rather than the country at large. Having said this, these are not new reasons. And accordingly, it's also important to talk about the triggers which have occurred recently and which have substantially exacerbated even these existing weak institutions present in the region. The trigger has been the overthrow of Qaddafi regime and the civil war, which followed and is still ongoing in Syria since 2011. Notably, Niger and Mali are closely located to Libya, and Qaddafi substantially relied on Tuareg nomadic tribes as a part of his military force. When the regime was overthrown and this force was no longer relevant, these hard-battled military men moved back to their countries, primarily to Mali, but also there to Niger. And in Mali, they particularly started the uprising for the independence of the northern Mali and the creation of the independent state of Azawad. This militia was joined by various jihadist, Salafist groups, where specifically the events in the Middle East and the advance of ISIS has made a substantial contribution. And so, for example, in Mali, quite within a short period of time, they managed to capture the bigger part of the country, advancing on the capital of Bamako. The result of this has caused, obviously, dissatisfaction with the civil government of the country, with its inability to oppose the advancing militia, and resulted in the military coup, as it quite happens in this region. Very similar situation we had in the Central African Republic, with the difference being that there is a historical conflict between the southern part of the country, which is mainly Christian, and the northern part of the country, which is Muslim. We have quite a similar situation to that which we've discussed in our video with respect to Sudan and South Sudan. So this historical animosity, together with increased competition for arable land, together with increased presence of various jihadist movements, as well as instability in Libya and the use of that countries as a main route for trafficking of immigrants to Europe, drugs, and also wildlife, exacerbated those tensions and caused the ongoing civil war in the country, where, again, it started with the advance of the Muslim militia against the capital of the country, Bangui, and resulted in the capture of the country. And thereafter, the opposition to that militia by the Christian self-organized group, partly formed by the defectants of the army of the Central African Republic, which was small and inefficient to bring down these militia groups. Niger was affected by all these events as a country which is neighboring both Libya and Mali. It's not a surprise that the spread of the Tuareg insurgency in Mali had a spillover effect of Niger, as well as the presence of jihadist groups in the region has its effect on the country. The country is more consolidated compared to the other two, so there is no real split in control over the territories by various factions. Nevertheless, for the reasons we've discussed, as the institutions are weak, the country cannot impose full control over its territory and suffers from the attacks of various radical groups, both in the north, which are primarily of the Libyan or Mali origin, as well as in the south, where Boko Haram is present. This map illustrates the situation with respect to Mali and the Central African Republic. I just put these two maps to demonstrate that even today, following the support which both countries received from international community and the United Nations to restore peace and order in the country, this is far from being the case. We see in pink on both of those maps the territories which are under control of the central government. And in essence, we can see that the substantial parts of the countries, exceeding half of them, basically remain under the control of various factions outside of the government controls. So there is, in essence, a ongoing civil conflict in all of those parts of these countries, triggered by the reasons we've just discussed. I will now touch briefly upon the main parties involved in those events. This is relevant because they are often the targets of the sanctions, and it's important then to understand what these parties are, to see the logic of those sanctions and what they aim to achieve. The MNLA is the Tuareg secular movement in Mali for the independence of the northern part of the country, where they want to create a Tuareg state called Azawad, or at least achieve a substantial autonomy for the people there. At the initial stage of the conflict, they were backed up by the Tuareg jihadist movement, which has its origin in the civil war in Algiers, which was suppressed by the central government, but not completely eradicate the movements. And so once the situation in Mali became destabilized, they re-emerged and joined the MNLA. And then we see in the country the presence of various jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, or, for example, the other jihadist group like Mujao. These are all radical Islamist groups which have their presence in the country due to the vulnerabilities which we've discussed. In the Central African Republic, key groups to remember is the Seleka, which is a generic term used to denote various Muslim militia. Officially, the group was disbanded once they took over the capital in 2013, but nevertheless is used in various sanctions program to describe the rationale for imposing the sanctions. Currently, the group is split in between various factions. The most important of them are set out in the slide, and they, in essence, control the north of the country. And then the Seleka groups are opposed by something which is called anti-Balaka, which again is a generic term to describe various Christian or animist militia, which in principle emerged as an opposition to Seleka, as an opposition to those attacks which were committed by them against the Christian communities in the Central African Republic. But as the situation developed, these groups become self-sufficient forces and sometimes team up with ex-Seleka groups to advance their agenda. Unlike in Mali and the Central African Republic, Niger remains a relatively unified country controlled by its now military government following the last coup in Niger, which occurred in summer 2023. Nevertheless, for the reasons we've discussed, the proximity of the country to Mali and Libya, the same groups which we have in Mali are present there and often conduct violent attacks against the National Army of Niger, as well as given that the country is equally sharing a border with Nigeria in the south, Boko Haram also has its presence in the country, conducting the same violent attacks. So against this political background, the targeted sanctions, which are currently in effect with respect to these three countries, are in essence to aimed to restore peace and security. And this is understood by the countries imposing those sanctions as the restoration of civil governments in those countries where, as a result of military coup, army came to power, namely Mali and Niger. And in terms of the Central African Republic, targeted sanctions are mainly aimed at punishing the warlords for those abuses of human rights, violence, as well as the general destabilization of the country which occurs. With respect to Mali, the UN sanction program, which was imposed following the events which we've discussed, so following the advance of MNLA and related jihadist movements against the central government and basically putting the north of the country under control. This resulted in the imposition of the UN sanctions, and those largely came to the end in 2023 when the central government regained control over at least south of the country. So as of today, there are no sanctions at the UN level with respect to Mali. And as a result of this, even, for example, trade in arms is not subject to any UN level restrictions. Nevertheless, many national sanctions regimes imposed originally to give effect to the UN sanctions remain in place. So is, for example, in the United States, United Kingdom, or the European Union, three major regimes which we typically discuss in our series. These are limited sanctions, primarily targeting the leaders of the military coup in place and the Wagner Group, which the military coup in Mali has been heavily relying to restore peace and order in the country. So politically wise, we talk about limited number of designations, mainly related to the persons from the military coup currently in charge of the country. As far as export controls are in place, Mali would be typically a heavily regulated jurisdiction where military equipment, dual-use goods, sensible technologies will be subject to the licensing requirements. Central African Republic sanctions remain in place both at the international and the national level. So at the international level, there is a limited arms embargo in place, which is currently limited to the supply of arms to the militia groups present in the country, which we've discussed, as well as the asset freeze and travel ban sanctions, which are primarily imposed on the leaders of those militia groups. And they're roughly the same, coming from Seleka or anti-Balaka groups, as well as, so to say, more international militia present in the Central African Republic, like the Lord's Resistance Army, which has its operations in the other Central African countries, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Uganda, or other countries in the region. So these sanctions have been imposed also at the national level by the United States, the European Union, and the UK, and their purpose is largely the same. They're largely replicating the UN designations and imposing personal sanctions on those militia leaders which are currently undermining the peace in the country, as well as giving effect to the arms embargo, which we've discussed, together with the same export restrictions which were mentioned in respect to Mali. The situation is different to Niger, where it would be fair to say that the local sanctions led by ECOWAS have been the primary tool of trying to change the course of events, namely to convince the military government to hand over the power to the civil government in the country. But those sanctions were really drastic and heavy, given very large reliance of Niger on, for example, energy supply from Nigeria, or Nigeria being the main export route for Nigeria's commodities. They were cut off of commercial relations with the country, which was almost complete, as well as the freeze of assets of, for example, Central Bank of Niger. Despite the very heavy effect those sanctions had on the landlocked country, the political effect was very limited. The government just became stronger. To a certain extent, the sanctions resulted in the popular opposition to the actions taken by ECOWAS, and so the approach was revised with the view to get engaged with the military leaders in place rather than to force this change by way of sanctions, which proved to be counterproductive. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.